At 6 a.m. on a quiet street in Green Bay, Wisconsin, the sound of knuckles against a wooden door breaks the dawn silence. A woman in her late 60s answers, her hair flattened on one side from sleep, the faint smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen behind her. On her porch stand two men in dark coats, badges glinting in the pale morning light. One is tall, with the rigid posture of law enforcement. The other holds a leather folder, his thumb pressing into the seam as if bracing for the next words. The taller man speaks first. His voice is low but carries an unmistakable weight. "Do you know a woman named Alina?" The name lands like a dropped stone in still water. The woman's expression changes quickly, subtly, before her mouth opens, then closes again without an answer. Behind her, a kettle begins to whistle. The moment hangs in the air, the faint hiss of the kettle growing louder. The agents exchange a glance, but neither fills the silence. The woman's eyes shift from their faces to the street, where a light dusting of frost still clings to the hoods of parked cars. Her hand rests on the doorframe, knuckles whitening, yet she doesn't invite them in. Instead, she asks them to repeat the name. The taller agent obliges, slower this time. "Alina." She closes her eyes for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the shorter agent to notice the tremor in her jaw. Across the country, in Reno, Nevada, a forensic laboratory hums under the fluorescent glow of ceiling panels. Computers line the counters, their screens flickering with the blue and green patterns of genetic data. A technician in a white lab coat reviews a digital family tree, its branches spreading outward from a single highlighted node. Next to her, a sealed evidence bag rests on the counter. Inside, a cotton swab taken from a body 37 years earlier. The paper label, yellowed with age, reads unidentified 1982. The technician clicks once and a match confirmation appears on screen. The room stays silent for several seconds before she exhales and mutters, "We've got her name." The air smells faintly of ethanol and printer ink. Somewhere in the back, a refrigeration unit hums, the sound constant and indifferent. The technician lifts the evidence bag with gloved hands and sets it into a larger container for transfer. As she does, her gaze lingers on a separate shelf where an acrylic display case holds an object unrelated to her current task. A pair of white canvas shoes, the soles caked in a reddish-brown residue that has long since hardened. They sit under a directed beam of light, casting no shadow, frozen in their final state. By mid-morning, the two agents in Wisconsin have left the porch without any clear statement from the woman. She had offered them no denial, but also no confirmation, only the careful language of someone weighing what to reveal and when. As their car pulls away, she remains standing in the doorway, one hand pressed to her temple as if trying to remember something half-buried. The frost on the street has already begun to melt, but her breath still clouds in the cold air. Back in Reno, the technician's report is being routed through secure channels, its arrival triggering a series of notifications on the desks of cold case detectives. Some have worked the case for years without a single new lead. Others are too young to remember when the victim was first found. The match does not solve the case. It does something more dangerous. It forces open the door to questions that have been sealed since the summer of 1982. In the dim archive room 2 floors below, the original case file sits inside a weathered cardboard box. Its edges are frayed, its handwriting faded. Photographs are clipped together in brittle plastic sleeves, showing the discovery site from multiple angles. In one, the victim's profile is partially obscured by tall grass. In another, the same white shoes rest beside a shallow stream, their laces splayed outward. The water in the image is so still it reflects the surrounding pines. No one has touched these photographs in years, but they have never been discarded. A senior detective stands over the box, flipping through the inventory sheet. His eyes pause at the line where the shoes are listed, along with the location and date they were recovered. He knows they are preserved now upstairs, but in 1982 they were simply tagged and bagged, one item among many. The reddish soil clinging to the soles is from a place miles away from where the body was found, a fact noted but never explained. That soil sample remains in evidence, untouched, its secret sealed in a vial. The detective closes the box and rests his palm on the lid, as if holding it shut a moment longer could delay what comes next. The DNA match is just the first breach. Once the name is confirmed, the weight of the investigation will shift from speculation to reconstruction. Every interview will be reopened, every photograph re-examined, every forgotten lead pulled into the light. It will be exhausting, but it will also be the first true momentum the case has had in decades. At the Wisconsin address, the woman who answered the door has drawn her curtains, the interior of the house dim now. She sits at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee cooling in front of her, her eyes fixed on the telephone. She does not touch it. Outside, the frost is gone, replaced by thin streams of meltwater along the curb. She whispers the name once quietly, as though testing how it sounds after all these years. The sound of it seems to fill the room, echoing off walls that feel closer than they did that morning. The forensic technician in Reno finishes her shift and walks past the acrylic display case one last time. The white shoes inside remain motionless, their once bright canvas dulled by time but unaltered in form. They are evidence, yes, but also something else, an unspoken question, waiting for the moment when the answer will finally arrive. What no one in the building yet knows is that the name tied to the DNA match will not only identify the victim, it will draw a line straight into another family's guarded history, and into a version of the past that some people have spent nearly 4 decades trying to bury. June 1982, in the foothills outside Reno, was warm enough to carry the scent of pine sap across Galena Creek Park. The creek itself ran low that summer, its water gliding in thin, clear ribbons over smooth stones. At 9 a.m., the only sound was the distant crack of branches as a pair of hikers moved along the trail, their voices low, carrying the calm rhythm of people who know these woods. The taller one stopped mid-step, tilting his head toward a patch of grass near the bend. He thought he saw the sole of a shoe. White against the green, it seemed out of place. At first he assumed it was trash left by careless campers, but as they approached, the outline became undeniable. A body lay curled on its side, head angled toward the water, one hand just brushing the creek's edge. The air changed the moment they saw her. It was no longer scented only by pine. There was an undercurrent, metallic and faintly sweet, the smell of blood as it mingled with damp earth. Her jeans were darkened where the fabric had absorbed water, the plaid shirt twisted at the waist, the top button missing. Her hair, chestnut and heavy with moisture, clung to her cheek. The hikers froze several feet away, unsure whether to move closer. One of them would later say he could not recall the color of her eyes because he could not bring himself to look past the shoes. When deputies arrived, the sun had shifted high enough to scatter light through the treetops, turning the water into shifting gold. A photographer stepped forward, the metallic click of the shutter repeating in steady intervals. Each shot caught details the human mind might choose to ignore. The dirt packed under her fingernails, a faint abrasion on the back of her neck, the way the laces of her left shoe trailed toward the stream. The sound of the camera was joined by the rustle of evidence bags and the muted voices of deputies marking coordinates. The scene was calm, almost too calm, as if the violence had been erased by the stillness of the morning. A coroner's assistant crouched low, inspecting the angle of her head. Rigor had begun to set in, the muscles holding her in a posture that might have been mistaken for rest if not for the disarray of her clothing and the purple bloom of bruising along her collarbone. He noted the absence of a purse, wallet, or identification. The trail around her showed no clear signs of a struggle. The grass was flattened only where she lay. The creek whispered past, indifferent to the work being done beside it. Witness statements were taken on the spot. The hikers spoke separately, each describing the same detail first, the shoes. One said he saw them before he saw her. The other said he saw her but could not look away from the whiteness of the canvas, so stark against the mud. It was an image that would follow them into their dreams for years, surfacing without warning. Investigators, too, would fixate on that visual: white shoes in a place where nothing else was clean. By noon, the park was closed off, yellow tape strung between trees like makeshift curtains. Officers posted at the perimeter turned away joggers and curious onlookers. In the distance, a child cried as his mother steered him back toward the parking lot. Those who had spent the morning in the park found themselves glancing over their shoulders, replaying every stranger they had seen on the trails, every car in the lot. The unease spread quietly, the kind that clings without proof. As the body was lifted onto a stretcher, droplets fell from her hair onto the packed dirt, each one darkening the ground before vanishing into it. A deputy carried the shoes separately, placing them in a paper bag marked with the date and time. The reddish stain on the soles was noted but not explained. In the heat of that day, the stain appeared almost fresh, though everyone knew it was not. The drive to the coroner's office took less than 20 minutes, yet inside the van the atmosphere was heavy, the air thick with the scent of damp fabric and something sharper beneath it. The driver kept his eyes on the road, avoiding the rearview mirror. Small talk was out of the question. Back at Galena Creek, the last of the evidence markers were being photographed. The lead detective walked the scene one more time, slow and deliberate, scanning the trees and the waterline. His notes were brief but precise. Female, estimated early 20s to early 30s, brown hair, moderate height, cause of death pending. He added one more line before closing the notebook: no signs of forced entry into the park. To him, that meant the victim had entered willingly, either alone or with someone she trusted. That assumption would shape the early theories for better or worse. The creek continued to run, carrying with it pine needles, leaves, and particles of silt. A week later, no trace of the crime would remain on its banks. But in that moment, beneath the shifting canopy and the murmur of water, the park had become something else entirely, a place where a life had ended and where questions had begun to multiply. That night, the hikers lay awake replaying their discovery. One remembered the quiet before they saw her, a silence so complete it seemed unnatural. The other remembered the sound of the shutter, how it felt mechanical, almost intrusive. Both remembered the shoes, and how something about them seemed wrong. Neither could explain why. In the coroner's lab, under fluorescent light, the victim's features were recorded, her injuries catalogued. A fine red dust was found along the seams of her shoes, different from the soil at the creek. This detail was noted in the report but received little discussion. For now, the priority was identifying her. Fingerprints were taken, though they returned no match in the system. Dental records were cross-checked with nearby states with no result. Each negative answer was another step toward the dreaded label, Jane Doe. In the weeks that followed, flyers were printed with a sketch based on her likeness. They showed a young woman with soft features, hair pulled back, gaze steady. Beneath the image, the words "Do you know her?" were printed in bold. These were posted in Reno's bus stations, grocery stores, and rest stops along the interstate. People glanced at them while buying bread or waiting for change, but recognition never came. The white shoes were placed in storage with other personal effects recovered from the scene. Their presence there was unremarkable at the time, just one item among many. No one then could have guessed how long they would sit in that room, or how sharply they would resurface decades later. In 1982, they were just shoes, until the stain on their soles became the only trace that might speak. Somewhere in the city that summer, someone knew why she had been in Galena Creek Park. Someone knew how she came to rest with her hand touching the water, her face turned away from the sun. That knowledge was kept close, hidden behind ordinary days and routine gestures. And for the moment, no one could imagine how far from Reno the first thread of truth would eventually be found. In the first weeks after the discovery at Galena Creek, the investigation gathered momentum with the weight of public attention behind it. Detectives worked long hours in cramped offices. the air heavy with cigarette smoke, and the faint odor of damp paper from case files spread across desks. The initial interviews poured in: hikers, park workers, nearby residents, each account noted in careful handwriting, stamped with the date and time. Among them was a brief statement from a man who had been driving past the park's north entrance at around 8 a.m. on the morning the body was found. He claimed he saw a dark blue van turning out of the lot, moving faster than the posted limit, its rear door rattling as if it wasn't fully latched. The driver, he said, kept his face low, hidden behind a baseball cap. That statement, taken in the bustle of the early canvass, never made it to the active case file. Somewhere between the interview and the report room, the page was clipped to the wrong folder, one belonging to an unrelated burglary case. In the official homicide binder, there was no mention of a van. No one on the primary team even knew the sighting had been logged. The man who gave the statement assumed, for decades, that the police had simply ruled it irrelevant. Without the van lead, the investigation leaned heavily on the theory that the killer had approached the victim on foot. Detectives began to focus on transient men seen in and around the park in the days before the murder, men sleeping rough in the tree line, wandering between rest stops, sometimes drunk, sometimes silent. Patrol officers stopped and questioned them, flipping through worn ID cards and making notes about their clothing, their shoes. The idea of a stranger passing through, committing a crime and disappearing fit the prevailing logic. It also fit the public's desire for the threat to be something external, something that could be chased out of town. In those early days, the command post in Reno buzzed with phone calls, the ring of rotary phones cutting through the low hum of voices. Leads came in faster than they could be verified. A waitress swore she saw the woman 2 nights earlier, sitting alone in a diner with a half-empty coffee cup. A security guard reported a woman matching her description wandering the edge of a shopping center parking lot. Each lead was logged, assigned, and eventually crossed out when nothing matched. The forensics of 1982 could offer only so much. The autopsy confirmed the cause of death as strangulation. Biological evidence was collected, sealed in paper envelopes, and stored in temperature-controlled cabinets. Fibers from her shirt were cataloged. Soil samples from the creek bank were taken, though no one yet compared them to the reddish residue on her shoes. The crime lab was competent for its time, but limited by its era. The most pressing goal was to identify her, and without a match in fingerprint or dental databases, that goal remained distant. Meanwhile, the absence of the van report began to shape the investigation's tone. If the killer was on foot, he must have been local, someone who knew the park's trails, someone comfortable enough to lead a victim into a secluded spot without arousing suspicion. This thinking narrowed the focus, and without anyone realizing it, closed off the possibility of a perpetrator who had been in and out of Reno within hours. Weeks later, the weather shifted. The dry heat of summer gave way to the first hints of autumn, and with it came a decline in tips. The press coverage slowed. What had once been front-page updates became brief mentions buried in the local section. Inside the department, the case board still held her photograph at the center, but the number of new leads had dwindled to almost nothing. Detectives found themselves revisiting old statements, searching for inconsistencies, but without the missing report, the crucial contradiction remained invisible. One officer, assigned to canvass the park's maintenance staff, noted an odd remark from a groundskeeper who claimed to have seen a vehicle by the creek early that morning. He couldn't recall the color or type, only that it wasn't the usual park truck. The comment was written in the margin of an interview sheet, not in the main body of the report. No one followed up. This accumulation of small oversights built a kind of false narrative. In it, the victim was last seen alive somewhere within walking distance of Galena Creek, and the killer was presumed to be a drifter. Patrol patterns shifted accordingly, focusing on known encampments and transient gathering spots. Arrests were made for unrelated offenses, public intoxication, petty theft, but none brought them closer to identifying the woman or her killer. Inside the evidence room, the shoes sat in their paper bag, labeled and sealed, the reddish soil untouched in a separate vial. The case technician assigned to maintain the storage log would later recall thinking the stain didn't match the clay-heavy dirt common to the park. She mentioned it once in passing, but was told the priority was identification, not environmental trace analysis. That decision meant another avenue of inquiry stayed closed for decades. By late fall, the trail had cooled. The leads that remained were speculative, built on tenuous sightings and vague descriptions. Detectives began rotating onto other cases, leaving the Galena Creek file in the hands of a shrinking core team. Morale dipped. The public, no longer seeing the case in headlines, assumed progress was being made behind the scenes. The truth was quieter. The investigation had settled into a holding pattern, waiting for something new to surface. The man who had reported the blue van went on with his life, moving out of state the following year. He never knew his statement had gone astray. In his mind, the police had asked, he had answered, and that was the end of his part in the matter. The memory of the rattling rear door, the lowered head under the cap, faded into the background of his thoughts, but it never disappeared. In the years that followed, the absence of resolution would weigh differently on those who had been close to the case. For some, it became an occasional frustration. For others, it was a quiet obsession, a reminder that one unanswered question at the start can echo through everything that follows. And in this case, the question of that van, its driver, its origin, its destination, was never even officially asked. What no one could have guessed then was how, decades later, the answer to that unasked question would slip back into view, carried by a technology none of them could have imagined in 1982. And when it did, the gap between the killer who might have been on foot and the one who was behind the wheel would become impossible to ignore. Years passed, and the murder at Galena Creek faded from the front pages into the margins of memory. But in Reno, it never truly disappeared. The case had left a residue, as persistent as the reddish stain on the soles of those white shoes. It lived in the way people avoided the far bend of the creek trail, in the quiet lowering of voices when the subject surfaced. For a small group, it became more than an unsolved crime. It became a fixation. One of them was a local painter named Harold Finch. Every summer, in the week leading up to the anniversary of the discovery, Harold would set up an easel in his small studio above a hardware store on Arlington Avenue. He would study the aging composite sketch of the Jane Doe, and he would paint her face again from scratch. Each year, her expression shifted slightly, sometimes softer, sometimes more severe, as if he were reaching for a truth he could never quite hold. The finished portrait always went to the same place, a narrow cafe near the river, where the owner kept a wall reserved for Harold's series. Over time, the wall became a kind of unofficial shrine, a silent ledger of years without answers. Detectives who worked the original case moved on or retired, but the file remained open. A cold case unit kept the evidence sealed and the photos locked in the archive. Periodically, a tip would come in, sometimes a phone call in the middle of the night, sometimes a letter with no return address. The envelopes carried no fingerprints, the handwriting was inconsistent, but the message was often the same. I know who she is. The words were short, almost casual, but they never led anywhere. Interviews with the senders, when they could be found, revealed confusion, mistaken identity, or outright fabrication. Still, every letter was logged, every call transcribed. The years between 1982 and 1990 brought changes in the city. New businesses opened, old ones closed, and the park where she was found became more developed, with new trails and picnic areas. But for some, the murder remained a boundary marker in their lives, before the Jane Doe and after. Parents warned their children about walking alone. Hikers kept mental notes of anyone they passed on the trail. The sound of snapping twigs in the underbrush could still tighten a chest, even 8 years later. In October 1990, the case surged briefly back into the public eye. A man walked into the Reno Police Department just after 3 p.m., wearing a windbreaker and carrying nothing but a folded piece of paper. He asked to speak to a detective about the Jane Doe at Galena Creek. In the interview room, he claimed responsibility for her death. His voice was steady, and he gave a timeline that fit the known facts. At first, it seemed like the break they had been waiting for. What unsettled the detectives was the level of detail he offered. He described the position of her body, the way her hand rested on the water's edge, and the missing top button of her plaid shirt. He even mentioned the way one shoelace trailed toward the stream. These were not details made public in the press. Listening to him, the lead detective felt the first stirrings of reluctant belief, but standard procedure required corroboration. The man's DNA was collected and compared to the biological evidence preserved from the crime scene. The result was unambiguous, no match. He was ruled out as the killer. When pressed on how he knew the details, the man claimed they had come to him in dreams, visions so vivid they felt like memories. Detectives considered the possibility that he had been fed information by someone with inside knowledge, but the trail ended with him. He was eventually released, but his confession left a lingering discomfort. If he had not been the killer who had given him the truth about the scene, the incident deepened the air of mistrust already surrounding the case. For some in the department, it reinforced the belief that the killer had remained close enough to monitor the investigation, possibly even mingling with those obsessed by it. The idea was difficult to prove, and without new evidence it became just another theory filed away. By the mid-1990s, the case slipped further into dormancy. Harold's portraits continued to appear in the cafe, and locals still glanced at them while waiting for their coffee, but fewer people recognized the significance. The cold case detectives cycled through other files, occasionally pulling this one back onto the desk when a new lead surfaced. Most fizzled within days. The white shoes, still sealed in their evidence bag, gathered dust under fluorescent light. Outside law enforcement, the murder took on a strange half-life. True crime enthusiasts traded theories in small, self-published newsletters. Amateur sleuths visited the park and walked the trails, hoping for inspiration. Some brought flowers to the bend in the creek, leaving them in silence. The ritual did nothing to change the facts, but it kept the memory alive. Every so often, an old detective would stop by the cafe and look at Harold's wall. The progression of paintings was like a clock marking time in brushstrokes. In the earliest portraits, she seemed almost alive, skin warm, eyes alert. As the years passed, her features sharpened, the shadows deepened. Harold never explained the changes. When asked, he simply said he painted what he saw in his mind. The unanswered questions multiplied over time, not diminished. Why had the van sighting never made it into the main file? Who had told the false confessor the private details of the scene? And above all, who was she, and why had no one come forward to claim her? These questions floated just below the surface of the city's collective memory, surfacing in quiet moments but never finding resolution. By the year 2000, advances in forensic science had begun to offer new possibilities, but the case was not yet revisited with the seriousness it would one day receive. The evidence remained untouched, sealed away from the light, waiting for a moment when technology and persistence would align. Until then, Galena Creek continued to flow past the place where she had been found, erasing and rewriting the landscape each season, while the truth about that morning remained locked in the mind of someone who had managed to keep their silence for decades. The silence itself became its own kind of presence in the case. Detectives could measure it in years without progress, in the absence of familiar names from the suspect lists, in the unbroken seal of the evidence bags. But silence is not the same as forgetting. Somewhere, someone was still carrying the weight of that morning, and in time, a single breakthrough would make their secrecy impossible to maintain. In 2017, 35 years after the murder at Galena Creek, the case file was reassigned to Detective Claire Hensley, a newcomer to Reno's cold case unit, but not to the discipline of forensic detail. She was 32, methodical, and known for scanning old evidence logs as if they were maps hiding an overlooked trail. On a winter morning, she sat at a steel table in the evidence room, the hum of the overhead lights steady, the air faintly metallic from the rows of sealed storage cabinets. She began by reading the property inventory aloud to herself, pausing at one entry: blue plaid shirt, multiple fibers present. The note was underlined in the original handwriting, but there was no follow-up in the file. She requested the shirt from storage. When the technician laid it out, its colors were faded, the fabric stiff from decades of preservation. Under magnification, she saw a single pale thread clinging to the seam near the cuff. It wasn't part of the shirt's weave. To the naked eye, it was almost invisible, but under the scope it had a fine synthetic sheen, unlike the cotton blend of the garment. There was no record that it had ever been analyzed. Claire sent the fiber to a modern trace lab. Within weeks, the results came back: polyester, dyed with a chemical composition no longer common in clothing, but still used in certain industrial applications. Cross-referencing manufacturing records pointed to a small list of textile producers. One was a Midwestern factory in Wisconsin that had operated through the 1970s and 1980, making uniforms for regional transportation companies. She paired this finding with a second angle: DNA. Previous efforts had extracted a profile from the biological evidence, but the technology of the early 2000s had not been able to take it further. In 2017, forensic genealogy was transforming that limitation. By uploading the unknown profile to a public genetic database used for ancestry tracing, they began mapping partial matches: second cousins, great uncles, distant relatives who had volunteered their data online. The branches spread slowly, a web of unfamiliar names, many clustered in Wisconsin and the surrounding states. By autumn, Claire had built a family tree with a common root in the Midwest. Among the connections was a woman named Marjorie Lang, 71 years old, living in Green Bay. Her DNA, submitted years earlier for a health study, placed her as a probable first cousin to the unidentified victim. Claire and a fellow investigator traveled to Wisconsin in November. The air was sharp with cold, the streets dusted with early snow. They arrived at Marjorie's house at 10 a.m. The siding was weathered, and the faint smell of wood smoke drifted from the chimney. Marjorie answered the door in a wool sweater, eyes narrowing slightly when they introduced themselves. She invited them in, the warmth of the living room tinged with the scent of old books and cinnamon tea. At first, she claimed not to know anyone who had gone missing, but as the conversation unfolded, her voice shifted. She spoke of a cousin named Elena, older by 2 years, who had vanished in the summer of 1982. She had left home without telling anyone, and the family, especially Marjorie's father, insisted she was running with the wrong crowd, words that carried a weight of moral judgment. They said Elena had probably joined a street gang, maybe in Chicago, and warned the children not to mention her name outside the family. Claire pressed for details, and Marjorie hesitated. She explained that the family's silence wasn't only about shame, it was about fear. In the years before Elena disappeared, she had been in a relationship with a man they all distrusted, someone older, itinerant, and possessive. The man had once shown up at a family picnic uninvited, leaning against a van with blue paint flaking off the side, his gaze fixed on Elena in a way that made everyone uneasy. No one had connected that memory to her disappearance until now, and even then, Marjorie seemed reluctant to name him. This admission shifted the entire frame of the investigation. The long-standing belief that the victim had been a transient herself was suddenly in question. Instead, there was now a link to a fixed place, a family, and a possible relationship that might explain how she ended up hundreds of miles from home. Back in Reno, Claire added the fiber analysis to the case file alongside the genealogy chart. The connection to a Wisconsin textile plant that supplied uniforms to transportation workers hinted at another possibility, that the fiber on Alina's shirt could have come from the van itself, from seat covers or upholstery manufactured in the same facility. It was the first tangible bridge between the victim's last known environment and the circumstances of her death. Yet even with these breakthroughs, the case was far from solved. The van Marjorie remembered was decades gone. The man she described had no surviving official link to Alina in public records. His name, if she decided to share it, would need to be cross-checked against every scrap of evidence from Reno in 1982. But the shape of the mystery was changing. In the quiet of her office, Claire reviewed the missing person reports from Wisconsin in the early 1980s. Alina's name was not among them. There had been no police file, no formal search. She had simply vanished from her family's conversations, her absence treated as a decision rather than a crime. That omission had allowed her to become a Jane Doe in Nevada without anyone connecting the two. The thought unsettled Claire. If the family's belief about Alina's gang life had been wrong, it meant they had lived for decades with a false narrative, one that protected them from a darker truth but also protected whoever was responsible. The secrecy had not only hidden Alina, it had hidden the possibility of justice. Marjorie agreed to provide a formal DNA sample to confirm the genetic link. As the swab was sealed and labeled, her hands shook slightly. She admitted she had never believed Alina was truly gone, that some part of her had expected a letter or a phone call one day. Now, she said, she wasn't sure whether the truth would bring comfort or something heavier. When Claire boarded her flight back to Reno, the evidence bags and reports in her carry-on felt heavier than their physical weight. She now had a fiber that pointed to a specific manufacturing source, a family connection that placed the victim in Wisconsin before her death, and a new, more intimate timeline of her disappearance. But she also carried a question that no report could yet answer. If the family had buried the truth about Alina's life, what else had they buried about the man who might have been the last to see her alive? And if that man was still alive in 2017, had he watched the silence around her case as a shield, one that was finally beginning to crack? The formal DNA confirmation arrived in early spring. The name that had been missing from the Galena Creek file for 35 years was finally written in black ink on the case report: Alina Brooks. With it came a flood of information that had been absent for decades: her birthplace, her last known address, the job she had held before vanishing in 1982. The details formed a life that had been invisible in Nevada, a life that made her more than the anonymous figure frozen in crime scene photographs. But the identification did not close the case. It opened another. The next step was to run the existing biological evidence from the crime scene through national DNA databases once again, this time not to identify Alina, but to identify the man whose presence had been found on her body. The match that came back was to a deceased male, his file tagged with a death date of 1999. His name was Thomas Rayner. On paper, Rayner had been an HVAC technician in Reno for most of the 1980s and early 1990s. His neighbors remembered him as quiet, methodical, a man who kept his tools in perfect order, and his lawn trimmed with almost military precision. But his law enforcement record told a different story. In 1985, he had been arrested in Idaho for assaulting a 24-year-old woman in a motel room. The charges were dropped when the victim, the sole witness, failed to appear in court. In 1991, he had been questioned in connection with a missing woman in Utah, but was released without charges. Claire studied his mugshot from the Idaho arrest. The image showed a man with narrow eyes and a mouth that appeared to smirk even when closed. His hair was cropped short, his posture loose in a way that suggested comfort in custody. She compared it to a Reno City employee photo from 1988. Same eyes, same mouth, but with a pressed work shirt and an identification badge clipped to the collar. The contrast between the two was stark, a reminder that a public face can conceal a private reality. Digging deeper, she found that Rayner had owned a blue panel van in the early 1980s. The registration records placed it in Reno from 1981 to 1984, aligning perfectly with the time of Alina's death. The description matched the vehicle Marjorie had recalled from the family picnic, and the one the long-lost witness had seen leaving Galena Creek the morning the body was found. The report from that witness, misplaced for decades, now felt like the missing puzzle piece that had been sitting just outside the box. The fiber analysis from Alina's shirt gained new relevance. Records from the Wisconsin textile factory showed that the same polyester material was used in custom seat covers manufactured for a small fleet of service vans purchased by regional contractors, including the company Rayner worked for. The probability that the fiber came from his van was now more than speculative. It was circumstantial evidence in tangible form. Then came the unexpected layer. A second hit in the DNA database linked Rayner's profile to another unsolved homicide, this one in Northern California in 1984. The victim, a woman in her late 20s, had been found near a creek in a wooded area, less than 2 miles from a campground. She had been strangled, and her shoes were missing from the scene. No suspect had ever been identified. At the time, the case was filed separately with no reason to connect it to Nevada. Now the forensic match drew an unbroken line between the two. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Remote location, water nearby, a victim targeted while alone, strangulation as the cause of death. The missing shoes in the California case added a chilling dimension. In Reno, the shoes had been left behind, stained and caked with foreign soil. In California, they had vanished entirely. Investigators debated the meaning. Was it a signature, or had the choice to remove them been opportunistic? Either way, the forensic link suggested that Alina's killer had not acted only once. Claire reconstructed the timeline of Rayner's movements. His work orders from the HVAC company took him across state lines. In the summer months, he often traveled to rural areas for installations and repairs, the kind of jobs that kept him away from scrutiny and placed him in proximity to potential victims. His routes, when plotted on a map, formed a pattern of overlapping circles in Nevada, California, and Idaho. She considered the psychology of his crimes. Rayner seemed to choose locations with natural cover and limited access points, places where a stranger's presence would go unnoticed. His victims were women alone, often transient in some way, travelers, hitchhikers, or those estranged from their families. The isolation of his chosen sites suggested a preference for control, both over the environment and the victim. The decision to leave or take the shoes might have been a way to mark the event, a personal ritual embedded in the act. Rayner's death in 1999 meant there would be no arrest, no interrogation to test these theories. He had collapsed from a heart attack in his driveway, his obituary in the local paper describing him as a reliable worker and valued neighbor. No mention was made of the unsolved cases that now bore his name. The gap between how he was remembered and who he likely was underscored the unease that ran through the cold case unit. For the families of his suspected victims, the identification was both a revelation and a wound reopened. In California, detectives reached out to the relatives of the woman found by the creek. They learned she had been on her way to visit friends when she disappeared, her path taking her along a highway Rayner was known to use. In Nevada, Marjorie was told that Alina's killer had likely committed at least one other murder. Her silence over the years, born from fear and family pressure, now felt like a weight she could never set down. Claire assembled the evidence into a comprehensive report. The DNA matches, the fiber trace, the vehicle records, the work history, the geographic overlaps. The document read like the anatomy of a predator whose existence had gone undetected for decades. Yet it was also incomplete. Without a living suspect, the narrative of his crimes would be built entirely from the fragments he had left behind. In the evidence room, the white shoes sat in their acrylic display case, unchanged except for the beam of light that illuminated them. They were now more than an emblem of the case. They were a silent witness to the moment his control ended and the investigations began. Still, one question loomed over the file, unanswered and unavoidable. If Rayner had killed twice that they could prove, how many more victims had walked into the quiet of a creekside trail and never walked out? The dead cannot confess, but sometimes their patterns speak louder than words. With Thomas Rayner, the patterns were inescapable. They lived in the routes he drove, the way he selected women with no immediate safety net, and in the landscapes he chose to stage his violence. Remote trails, water nearby, sparse foot traffic. Places where the sound of a scream would dissolve into wind through pine needles or the steady rush of a stream. The evidence suggested these were not impulsive choices but rehearsed selections, repeated until they became part of his identity. Interviews with people who had crossed his path in the early 1980s painted a portrait of a man adept at seeming harmless. He fixed air conditioners in the summer, plowed snow in the winter, kept a thermos of coffee in his van. He could talk about the weather or the condition of a road without looking directly at the person he was speaking to. And when he did make eye contact, there was a pause, a fraction too long, that left people uneasy without knowing why. The physical evidence told its own story. In Alina's case, the killer had left her white shoes in place, laces untied, soles stained with soil from somewhere else. In the California case, the shoes were missing altogether. Investigators began to suspect that Rayner treated the shoes as a personal signature, deciding whether to leave or remove them based on an internal logic only he understood. It was a way of leaving his presence behind, a mark that would outlast the moment. The most vivid reconstruction of the night Alina disappeared came from a man who had never known her name until police contacted him in 2018. He had been driving along the road skirting Galena Creek Park on an early summer evening in 1982. The light was low but not gone, the horizon streaked with gold fading to blue. Ahead of him, a blue panel van sat idling on the shoulder, its rear doors open. A man was standing by the driver's side, one arm resting on the roof. The witness slowed, expecting to see someone unloading equipment or struggling with a flat tire. Instead, he caught a glimpse of a young woman in the passenger seat. She was turned slightly toward the open door, her face pale in the dim light. The man outside glanced up as the car passed, and the witness remembered the sharpness of that look, calculated, measuring, as if committing the sight of his vehicle to memory. He did not stop. At the time, it seemed like a moment without weight, just another stranger on the roadside. It was only when detectives showed him the photograph of Rayner decades later that he felt the old unease return. He was certain it was the same man. The most jarring moment for the investigative team was when they pulled his original 1982 statement from storage. It matched, detail for detail, the memory he had just given them. And then they saw the notation in the margin, "See related case file." That notation had sent his account into the wrong folder, the folder of a burglary case, where it had been buried for decades. What could have been a direct lead in the first week had vanished into clerical error. Piecing together that night, detectives believed Rayner had met Alina earlier in the day, perhaps under the pretext of offering her a ride. Whether she accepted willingly or under pressure was unclear. He drove her to the park as darkness approached, choosing a bend in the trail close to the water but hidden from the road. The attack was swift, the method controlled, strangulation, leaving minimal noise, minimal mess. Forensic psychology painted the act as one of domination more than rage. Rayner seemed to take care in arranging his victims after death, placing them in positions that suggested rest rather than struggle. This was not compassion. It was ownership, a final staging that allowed him to walk away with the sense that he controlled both the act and how it would be discovered. The decision to leave the shoes in place for Alina, their laces trailing toward the stream, was likely part of this staged presentation. His earlier assault charges fit the same framework. The Idaho victim had described being overpowered without warning, the attack stopping abruptly when she managed to scream loud enough to attract attention. Rayner had fled, leaving behind nothing that could directly tie him to her except her testimony that evaporated when she disappeared before trial. That disappearance, whether by coincidence or design, reinforced his sense of invulnerability. The Galena Creek scene bore no signs of improvisation. Even the placement of the body, one hand touching the water, mirrored elements seen in the California case. In both, nature was not just a backdrop but a participant, erasing traces, masking sounds, and softening the violence in the eyes of whoever found the victim. By 2019, with the full mosaic of his movements, methods, and linked cases laid out, the portrait of Rayner as a serial predator was unavoidable. Yet he had walked through life largely unnoticed, his public identity unblemished enough to leave neighbors describing him as reliable. This dissonance between his inner reality and outer presentation was what had allowed him to operate for so long. For Marjorie, hearing the reconstructed account of Alina's final night was like reopening a wound she had tried to cauterize with silence. The image of the blue van, the roadside glance, the white shoes by the stream, each was a fragment she could not erase. The fact that the account had existed in police records from the beginning, but had been lost, made it worse. The truth had not been absent all these years. It had been misplaced, waiting in the dark for someone to finally look in the right place. The case file now contained 2 murders conclusively tied to Rayner and the strong possibility of more. Investigators began cross-referencing missing persons reports from the 1980s in every state his work had taken him. The process was slow, but the patterns were already emerging. Rayner had not been a man who acted once in a moment of chance. He had been a man who learned from each crime, refining his choices, his settings, his control. And somewhere among the open cases in dusty archives, there might still be another scene by another creek, another pair of shoes gone or left behind, another victim whose story had never been told. In the summer of 2019, 37 years after her body was found by the bend in Galena Creek, Alina Brooks came home in the form of a small, unadorned urn. The coroner's office released her remains to Marjorie, who carried them in both hands as if the weight might shift without warning. On a clear August morning, family members gathered at the very spot where her life had ended. The air was warm but restless, a breeze moving through the pine branches overhead, carrying the faint scent of resin and the sharper undertone of the creek's cold water. They placed the urn on a flat stone, surrounded by flowers, white lilies, wild daisies, and sprigs of sage picked from the hills nearby. Some in the group had never met Alina in life. Others remembered her as a quiet but restless presence, always looking toward the horizon. The silence among them was not empty. It was layered with years of unasked questions, and the knowledge that answers had arrived too late for justice. The city of Reno authorized the installation of a memorial plaque at the park's entrance, a simple bronze plate mounted on a cedar post. Beneath her name and the dates of her birth and death was the sketch Harold Finch had first painted in the year after she was found. He attended the unveiling, standing slightly apart from the crowd, hands in his coat pockets despite the heat. The likeness, once the best guess of an artist working from second-hand descriptions, now sat beneath a photograph of Alina provided by her family. The resemblance was uncanny. Visitors slowed as they passed, drawn first by the image, then by the inscription that ended with 2 words, "Never forgotten." The plaque became a quiet fixture in the park. Joggers would sometimes pause to read it, Hikers left small offerings, stones, pine cones, folded notes tucked into the base. Children asked about the woman in the picture, and parents, unsure how much to say, spoke of someone who had been lost and then found again. For those who had carried the case in their minds for decades, the plaque was more than a marker. It was proof that the anonymity which had defined her for so long had finally been lifted. In the months following the identification, Nevada lawmakers passed a bill to expand funding for forensic genealogy in cold cases predating 2000. The vote was unanimous. Legislators cited Alina's case by name, holding it up as an example of how modern science could repair the failures of earlier decades. Grants were issued to re-examine evidence in long-dormant files, with the hope that other families might receive the same measure of closure. For Detective Claire Hensley, the conclusion was both professional and personal. She attended the memorial in plain clothes, standing at the edge of the gathering. Watching Marjorie set the urn down at the creek's edge, she thought about the thousands of miles and hundreds of hours that had passed since the fiber on the cuff of a shirt had caught her attention. The satisfaction of solving the case was tempered by the knowledge that the man responsible would never stand in a courtroom, never hear a jury speak his guilt aloud. Still, there was meaning in the act of naming, of returning Alina to her family. The secrecy that had shrouded her story was gone, replaced by a narrative that could be spoken without fear. The truth, however delayed, had a way of changing the landscape, not just for those who had loved her, but for the community that had unknowingly carried her absence for nearly 4 decades. Back in the evidence room, the acrylic case containing the white canvas shoes was moved to a central display. The reddish-brown soil clinging to the soles had hardened into a crust over the years, each crack in the surface a map of where they had been. Beside them, under the same beam of light, now stood a framed photograph of Alina taken a year before her death. She was standing in a field, hair lifted by wind, her smile small but unguarded. The juxtaposition was stark, the shoes that had once been the only clue to her identity and the face that had finally reclaimed it. In the stillness of that room, the case felt less like an archive and more like a quiet conversation between the past and the present. The shoes no longer stood alone. They were part of a whole, one that could finally be seen in full. Outside, Galena Creek moved on, water sliding over stone as it had the morning she was found. The bend in the trail was unchanged, the same mix of shadow and sunlight, the same sound of wind moving through pine. But for those who knew what had happened here, the place now held another layer, one of recognition, of a life restored to its name, and of the silence that had been broken at last.